Thank you for coming. I'm Verl Farnsworth, Chairman of Constitution in the Classroom, and Adrian Weiss will share today's lesson and instruction with me. Last week, each of you got an introduction to free enterprise and free markets. And one of the reasons that we start with that as our lesson is that under the banner of freedom itself, free markets and free enterprise affects everybody. And it should. Now, there's a principle involved in free markets and free enterprise that some do not even recognize, and that is that within that system, there are a number of checks and balances. So I'll ask you a question. Within free markets and free enterprises, what would be a check and balance? We have that. We hear it all the time in the way our government is organized with the three branches and distribution of rights and powers. But how does it pertain to free markets and free enterprise? What's a check and balance?
Competition.
Okay, competition. Okay, what's another check? Have you ever heard if you don't work, you don't feast or eat? Well, see, that's a natural process, and it's all a piece of freedom itself. And so when we understand how this Constitution and its the powers that it protects and the rights that it protects, then we can better understand why free markets and free enterprise is part of the system, because it has its own checks and balances for individuals to work with and work under to be held accountable for themselves. And so it fits. It's not what others who want to tear down the free market system have in mind. It's not a system of handouts. And it never was. You'd never have freedom, you wouldn't have this Constitution, and you wouldn't have the protections that you have today if everything was a handout. Because ask yourself the question, how many of these rights did King George actually hand out to the patriots? Zero. None. So when you understand the process, truth follows a pattern. In all areas, you will not be deceived if you understand the pattern that truth follows. Okay? That's important. Well, what you learned is that there's been this almost 6,000-year history of where nothing progressed until in the American system we ended up with freedom. And individuals had the right to own their own time and their own labor. And that, of course, brought about this marvelous revolution that some refer to as the Industrial Revolution, and now they've subtitled 3 more of them since then. But all of that is a part of the process of freedom all by itself. But what was significant is when you analyze it is that all of that is within a 200-year period. The whole nucleus of that process is contained within a 200-year spot of time in the history of mankind. And if you wanted to be a paleontologist and you want to study history and age by the age of the rocks, we even do better, don't we? 200 years in the 50 million plus that they say the earth has been here or man has existed, and we take this amount of exalted advancement in a 200-year period, it's even better than you take it from the creation story, okay, with a 6,000-year time frame. So the significance of this industrial enlightenment is very significant to its very happening in the history of America and in the world itself. This is important. We have to get ourselves into a frame of mind to think like they were thinking and why they were thinking the way they were thinking. How did they come up with the principles of freedom that they arrived at? What was their thinking that drove that to get to those conclusions? What were the guidelines in their lives that kept them from going off, which we're going to study later here, in the tyrannical or just anarchical mind? Okay? There is a success formula, and we're going to discover that completely today in the fact that the rule of law, as it has come known here in America, replaced ruler's law, which has ruled the earth from the beginning of time. In every society, ruler's law has prevailed. But the rule of law now, you're going to learn before you walk away today how to recognize immediately which of these two systems that you're living under. Alexander Tytler, and this diagram is in your workbook, and for me, that workbook is for you. I'm not going to teach you from the workbook today. You use that as a review. If you want to fill it out as we go and you catch parts, that's great. Alexander Tytler was a contemporary of the Founding Fathers. He lived in the very same time frame of time. He was a Scottish philosopher, socialman in their country, not the social democrat person, but he was very social in his own environment, understanding this cycle that he had studied, and he overlaid all of the civilizations of mankind in this cycle. And he found that every one of them fell within all of these parameters right here as they moved from one stage to the next, and that there could be no advancement or no decline without having arrived at the previous stage. Okay, so when you stop and think about the founders and what they did, and we all have lived, all of us in this room have lived in this piece right here, where the abundance of what we could have in our lives compared to what mankind has enjoyed. This is exact, but we couldn't get it without liberty, courage, and spirituality. So when you ask yourself, where were the founders in this diagram? Where was their point, and where did they then advance? Well, King George is the top, isn't it? They were in bondage. They didn't have the freedom that we certainly enjoy or what they ended up with. But the next step, before you will ever find courage, is a relationship with God. And without that, you will never have confidence to move yourself forward or to lead others in that process. So when those who want to knock the Constitution or knock the founding of America or its basis, they do not understand this process that is absolutely necessary for the advancement of mankind. Absolutely necessary. So when we hear stories about their spirituality, about their daily, yes, Con.
What I see in my life, looking from what I've seen, I've lived through some liberty, abundance, selfishness. I can see this now. We've gone through a period of selfishness, complacency, apathy, and a large part of this country is independency. So is our next stop, do we have to go through bondage, or can we change it before we get there?
That's the question that you're going to be able to answer for yourself, maybe not today, but in the next few years of your life, you're going to see whether or not the American citizenry can change or to shorten any of the time frame that each one of these steps go through. In other words, I think that each of you would agree that we're in some role moving, and each of you have your own idea of, whether we're all here. Well, 47% 4 years ago is the figure we heard, remember, from Mitt Romney in the campaign of dependency. So we weren't all dependent on government 4 years ago. What has been the advance from then to now? And so you're asking yourself that question. But the course here is, if we do not change, we will be in bondage because there isn't any other place to go when you continue in this cycle. That's the key. So when you understand this cycle and why and what it takes to move past or to shorten each of them, in other words, how do you shorten dependency and bondage? You have to look ahead, don't you? So what are you looking ahead to? Spirituality. Yes. See, in other words, this is so plain that if you want to shorten the periods of dependency and bondage, you have to get to here as quickly as you can. Spiritually, for the people as a whole. And if you can do that, then courage to do the right things will be next. So how long we'll be in each of those stages is up to us as a people. So, but it is really important to understand that this is how they thought. Now remember, you have to think like a founder. Well, this is what they were thinking like. This Alexander Tytler was a contemporary. This was the mindset it seemed to be, at least all through the English sector of the world and those that had come to America. This was the mindset to move towards spirituality with some sort of divine nature and divine call in order to bring to pass what they really felt was the right thing to do. Well, John Adams. Now, what you're going to learn today, we're going to talk some about individual founders. And hopefully in that process, you will be able to discover or rediscover how spiritual these men and how much courage they really did have in this fight for freedom. But this is a call for all of us right here. It becomes necessary to every citizen to be in some degree a statesman. Now, last week you might have talked a little about a patriot, a statesman. Well, you can have politicians. We don't call them statesmen. We don't give them that accolade anymore, do we? They're politicians, and that has its own definition. That's not a statesman anymore. We have very, very few statesmen that are in the system right now, very few, comparative to the 550 plus, that we have as elected representatives.
They might be able to earn that a little better if we had term limits.
And those are the things that as a people we need to look at and discuss and find. And is there a detour before you would need term limits? That's one of the other questions that each one of us have.
Go ahead.
Term limits, that eliminates good people. We need to get out of this democracy mode, put back the 17th Amendment, and it'll take care of itself.
Okay, so with an understanding and thinking like the founders, then some things that we think we might need to do to turn things around may not be necessary if we can advance to that level of spirituality and find the courage that is necessary. Some things that we think might be fixes may not be necessary. So, but that's where we as a citizenry have to decide what we're going to do to maintain the freedoms that were granted to us. We've done very little to earn them, for ourselves. A well-instructed people alone can be permanently a free people. Well, that's what we're here today. And that's what we do as we go into the schools, trying to plant these seeds to instruct the next generation that their freedoms come because of the proper instruction that they will receive, so that they will know how to make decisions about whom they elect and what differences of laws that they choose to allow to be passed. The good sense of the people will always be found to be the best army. Now, you ask yourself, okay, then this is really neat. Common sense is how important. I mean, it's really kind of the basis of everything, isn't it? Just to think in a functional manner, what we call common sense, is so incredibly important that we can't be disjointed about common sense. We all have to recognize, accept, and use that in the process. And remember, what common sense is a collective of the right things. I can tell you it is not a collective of the wrong things. It is a collective of what is right. Okay? So, we come to George Washington. We love, adore, some nearly worship him. He would be just thoughtful of that. But a primary object should be the education of our youth in the science of government. How does that statement alone fit with a statement in the Old Testament? When we talk about youth, and it says, train up a child in the way that they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. So how important is it to train our youth early in their lives to their future benefit. Please, Charlene.
Well, we see the opposite of that, of not training the youth. Look at our country today. So many parents do not teach their kids right principles. They just figure the government's going to do it. And this is what's happened.
It's incredible that when we trust it to somebody else, how lacking that fulfillment can actually be, isn't it? So for each of us. But now can you begin to see, just in a very brief moment, and we'll go there in much more detail, is there a spiritual basis to freedom? There is, absolutely. You cannot separate it. And those who want to separate it don't believe in freedom. They believe otherwise, bondage and slavery. Okay? Now, you learned a little, but here we go. Everything in the world can be measured. And this is how the founders chose to measure government. Kings on the far side, when everything is one man or a very small group, making all the rules, divvying out all of the enforcement, and treating the people to whatever level they wanted and giving them micro pieces of freedom along the way. All the way down to when there is no government, which is anarchy. Have we had a recent time where we have experienced this in the world, anarchy? Give me one.
Zimbabwe.
Okay? And we had recently, and we had a...
I mean, it's been years.
Years.
Still, another place is on the Horn, on the east coast of Africa. What's that place called? I mean, they're in anarchy now.
Sierra Leone.
Huh?
Sierra Leone.
Well, that's on the other side, on the western side.
Well, we just had the, remember what they call it in Egypt? The Arab Spring. There was a period of time there where it was no law. That's anarchy. And so the founders gave us a way to measure what government should look like in terms of benefiting the people. And so on one side is government control in every area. On the other end is anarchy. Do we have a choice between those two? Well, we do, but we can't choose either of them, can we? Because none of those will give us a productive, safe life or a community to live in. So somewhere in this process between these two elements and extremes is where the proper role of government should find itself. And that's where we as a people have to make sure that we know that and we do what it takes to keep it aligned there correctly.
Can I make
Please.
a comment that really the freedoms are not necessarily something that the government can do anything about unless the people themselves are righteous people and have at their core the interest of preserving the freedoms and rights of others. Yeah. So in other words, this idea of government being the I understand that we have to focus on what we can do to have a government that preserves freedoms. But regardless of what the government is, if the people are not motivated by the principle of protecting the rights of other people, the government won't make a difference.
Well, see, and that's why, as you're going to learn, we the people, that's the beginning, that's how the founders, again, remember, now we're trying to think like they did. We the people, what did that concept really mean? Why was that at the beginning of the preamble of the Constitution, and why was it in big letters? Why was it really meant to stand out? Please.
Well, I assume it means because it was the people that are supposed to be our government, not we the government, So they wanted to let them know that it was the people of our area and our country and all the colonies.
And that's what we need to understand. This government belongs to us. It is of the people. Okay?
It might even be better to say we the persons, because it's not so much the collective idea as it is the individual idea.
Well, meshing together, isn't it? Now, let's just take a look at ruler's law. Because if we understand what ruler's law looks like, we will be able to identify it immediately in our own midst, okay, wherever it happens to be. They go by all kinds of different names, but they're all collective in terms of ruler's law, okay? So, these are just some of the things that you will find under ruler's law, and if you can spot these, then you will have an idea that that's either what you're living under partially or what others may be. This will help you define. People live under rulers' edicts, decrees, and whims. Okay? Is any of that happening here in America?
Yeah.
And what's the basis that we target with that? How do we know that? Where does the whims and all come from?
Because it goes, just according to what's popular at
Okay,
the
but who throws it out there?
mostly the left.
The president.
Presidential orders.
The president or executive orders. Okay? See, so in other words, you can look and you can define whether or not any of these things are happening. They may be a little different word that helps us to understand that. Okay? People do not have rights. Okay? Did you hear? This is just an example. We had a presidential candidate this past week who said, if it is a right, it is up for regulation. Okay, so what does that mean? That you really don't have any rights if they're going to regulate it out of your control and into another bounds. Okay, so that would give us an idea that maybe some of ruler's law has crept in under that little subtitle. Okay? How many of you understand the EPA? Well, none of us understand it, but we know that it exists. So how much of your life is directed by others, period? What you get to do, consume, the FDA, all those are elements where some other ruler's law is directing your life. Okay? So, I'll ask you this question, the very bottom one. If the whole principle of freedom and government involvement is to raise the people from a level of poverty to some level of abundance, is that what's happening in America today? I mean, it's not, is it? If we have more and more people going on to food stamps and welfare and government aid, then the freedom that is meant to bring this to pass certainly is not being allowed to function. And so whenever you see these things, you can be sure that it's ruler's law more so than rule of law that is being followed. Okay? This is how it always comes to pass, by force, violence, and conquest, and or rarely, but it can happen by apathy. So, how do we fit here in America today? Sure, we've had a few, riots here and there, but we haven't had any sweeping violence or conquests or break-off governments here in America yet, have we? But we certainly have had a lot of apathy. And that allows that unrighteous rule of kings to supplant the rule of law when we become apathetic and not involved. Now, I would hope that from now and forever, I'll have to throw this plug. I don't have all the details, but the city of Mesa is asking for volunteers to come and assist with a Freedom's Day celebration. If any of you have a little extra time, you need to contact them and get on the committee and go get involved in some manner to help make that a successful community event, please.
Is that for the 4th or is that for the 17th?
It's for the 4th, I believe. Yeah, it's up and coming really soon. So in other words, this is a way that you could grab a neighbor or your grandchildren or others and go and find a way to get involved in something that you would never regret. ever. And there is need, because I saw the announcement in the paper just this week again. So please, here again, that presidential candidate, if you have a right, that means it can be regulated. Well, that means really that there are no unalienable rights. So as you get, next week, as you get to the Declaration of Independence, you're going to learn that you have and have always had unalienable rights that are yours and that nobody has the right to usurp from you. They're yours, period. You can give them up by apathy, you can never defend them, you can lose them in that manner, but nobody has the right to take them from you. Okay? So you will learn that. So all of these are elements to help us to understand where is America in that cycle? Where are we at? What did Alexander Tytler and others see 200 plus years ago about the development of civilization and what it takes to be successful?
You know, you're talking about that authority taken by force, violence, and conquest, and sometimes by apathy. And it seems like that what's happening in today's world is more that we're bartering away the rights in exchange for goods. In other words, we're greedy. It grows out of the desire to have the fruits of someone else's production without any effort on our own. In other words, greed is to get without paying for it, right? There's no exchange. So we're bartering away our rights so that we can have benefits of someone else's labor.
You know, and in our own homes, if we have not properly taught our children, you know, that good education is going to be important to them and it's going to pay them for 50 plus years. And if they don't get that, we forewarn them that life is not going to be very easy. And they may have to choose to do something that they didn't want to do. And it may be more of a handicap later to them than they ever wished. But those are going to be eventualities. Because even for somebody to hand you all this stuff, you still don't get what you want or what you need. So, ownership of property. This is absolutely essential to freedom for each of us. So, as we have these defining regulations and overtaxation, or if that happens to the people and they cannot pay their bills and pay those debts and those taxes, what happens to their property?
Confiscated.
It's confiscated, isn't it? In lieu of the tax that should have been paid. Then who owns it?
The ruler.
Whoever that is, be it the bank, the ruler, by whoever declares that you owe that substance or that penance to, now becomes the owner of that property. And the more of that they own, the less the people have, isn't it? So we have to be very careful about continuing to vote for and or without clearly analyzing all tax increases. Gene can tell you the city of Mesa is in a terrible predicament because of bonds and those things that have been passed and the extensions of the payback on that, which will take umpteen years to do. Mesa is not anywhere close to being free as a society. We are hugely in debt. Please.
Well, you heard the other day, or in the last 2 weeks, a member of the Treasury Department went to Puerto Rico to help them talk about refinancing their debt. That's a code word for bailing them out. If we bail out Puerto Rico, Illinois, New York, California are waiting in line with gazillions of dollars of debt.
You know, that vote, I think, is Monday in the Senate about whether or not Puerto Rico will be bailed out of this situation. Okay, and you're right. Precedents, and those of you that know anything about the way law is practiced now, other than the way it used to be based on principle. Now it's all based on precedents. And so anytime you could get something to happen twice or even once, it strengthens your case to get it to happen again. And when that becomes a precedence, then it becomes the rule. And it becomes the rule, there's never a question about if Johnny gets it, Jim gets it. It's automatic. And the amounts have nothing to do with it. And that's what we're letting happen in our society today, is we have, and I can only just say, we as the people are guilty of that process. Because sometimes we're so willing to win or to be the victor in a contest that we allow those representing us to win however they need to. That sets a precedence in our lives and in our government of law, how things are to be decided for the rest of our generation and the next generation and beyond. Sometimes we need to understand that we could lose and lose on the right principles, and it would strengthen the whole system rather than to feel that you would win on incorrect principle. So, kings, this is the power, all from the top, isn't it? From the top down. We understand that. So if it's going to be different with the people, where's the power going to come from? It's going to come from the bottom. Okay? That's where you will notice. When all your rules and all of that are a result of being told what is best for you, then that's top-down government. That's the elite deciding how you are to live, because they know more about it than you do. So that's a very dangerous position to be in. So that's where we have to question those that we elect to represent us in Congress. Is it our views? Now, we hear that all the time. In fact, just in this campaign just now, Ralph sent me an email where there's one of the candidates who wants our input as a people, what we think ought to happen. Now, if we could do that and the voice of the people could rule again, things might begin to change. So is it just an action when they ask for that, or is it really their intention to listen to the voice of the people in deciding what they will do and what they will choose later? That's what we have to decide and make sure.
Did you read my response to the...
I did. Go ahead, Charlene.
A lot of those things come through the mail, and then at the end it says, please contribute such amount of money. And I don't even think they read the survey, they just want the money.
Yes.
We get those from the Republican Party every so often.
So each of you are beginning to recognize in your own mind the way government needed to look according to the founders' formula and the way it is today. You can already see the holes and the rust and the contamination that is in the system. Please.
I was just going to make a comment that we don't need to ask permission to have our representatives in government listen to us. Okay, we can make our voice heard. And often if we become the squeaky wheel and we present a good case to them, they will do what we want them to do just to get us off their back.
To get the wheel to stop squeaking.
Yeah.
And that's correct. Now you can see where a united people is going to be the only effective means by which we can make a change. Okay? That's for all of us.
And if enough people raise a point of order with various government officials, and it doesn't take very many, if it's 100 or 150 write in and protest, it will influence that government official.
Oh, it will. It will.
So these are all signs of rulers' law.
Yes.
And when you see the military and the police being, manipulated to work in behalf of the government instead of the people, that's another sign that we can see where the order of government is rulers' law benefit not rule of law for the people. Okay, so you can begin to see that. It's not a matter of where you stand on immigration. Okay, it's not a matter of the level of compassion that you have for another individual. It's really all about the rule of law. And we're going to discuss that in just a minute. Here we've been there, as we've discussed, this part of the process where kings have all the power, all the control, own all the wealth. Well, that's ruler's law. And when you can't spend your own money the way you want, and you can't take it out of the bank whenever you want or in the amount that you want without somebody tracking it, then what's really taking place, people? That's another infringement of government against your personal property rights. We need to understand, and I don't think there's anybody in this room that doesn't agree to some level that we have tyranny again moving its way back into the daily operations of America. We just have to figure out how, for ourselves, and how we can convince others in the process, because we need their help in this fight back, this pushback. That's the goal for each of us, is to figure out how to do that, to convert our neighbors and friends, to let them know that you're coming, to the edge of a cliff. And as you know, it won't just be you that goes over, it's going to be everybody that's going to go over that cliff when it happens. So
this number 6 here is that so many of the laws that affect us are not even passed by the legislature. They're not passed by our representatives. They are abdicated by the representatives to groups of bureaucrats. And that is basically much of our problem is that the rules are not made with any degree of input from the people. It's the decisions of the...
You understand that? What part of the Constitution do you need to use as your substance to push back against federal regulation? Article 1, Section 1. All lawmaking authority belongs to a Congress. Okay? Nowhere else is that power granted to anybody else, not to a federal agency, regulatory agencies, or anybody. So when you understand the Constitution, then you can quote that back to individuals, because remember, you have to think like a founder. It has to be founded and grounded in law in order to be effective and to move coherently from one generation to the next.
When Congress won't use what the Constitution gave them, the power of the purse, to stop that type of regulatory encroachment.
Okay, but the power
belongs to who?
Well, we vote those people out.
So that's it.
Yeah.
See, ultimately, people, it's us. If we are upset enough about what is happening, and we're not apathetic in the process. Now, we can understand it, and we can know, but if we're apathetic about it, nothing's going to get done, is it? As much as you think about it or dream about it, unless we get involved collectively together in this process, nothing's going to change. Because the power still here in America yet belongs in the voice of the people. That's where it still belongs. So, you ask yourself this question: could ruler's law return? We might insert, another slide right here that might say something to the effect: has ruler's law already returned? Okay, so that's just a good idea. When you're talking about ruler's law, these are some of those telltale signs. They've all been mentioned by you here today. All of those are unconstitutional regulatory bodies, not authorized by the people, none of them authorized by an amendment to the Constitution. None of those rules and laws under regulatory law have been agreed to by the people's representatives even, nor by the people. So we really do have a system that is not constitutional as a whole. As much as you want or you hear from the politicians today that it is and it's a democracy, well, what I forgot to tell you, and I'm going to end there and advance to Adrian, is in Alexander Tytler's whole process, remember the graph now moving from bondage to spirituality to courage and all of that? Okay, what he said was this, and it's in your book, but he says that eventually in a democracy, that the people vote to themselves gifts from the public treasury until the public treasury becomes broke. And when it is then broke, it is always followed by a dictatorship, which is ruler's law. That's what you have happen. And so as we look at this and we analyze what's happening, we know that we've got to figure out how to get from that dependency piece and so forth on the upper left side of that graph and get back over to spirituality and get back over to courage in order to make those changes that we need to take place, in America. Now, let me ask you this question, because I've got to move forward for Adrian, Mark. In this contest, okay, if you don't love what you have enough to defend it and fight for it and potentially give your life for it, how deep is your love? All of us ask ourselves that question, and we have to decide for ourselves. What is the extent and where is it that we will no longer find what? The courage to move forward in this battle, to stand for what is right in this process. Where do we bail out or drop ourselves off of the list, or do we stay into it all the way to the end? Because if you're not into it to the end, how does anybody that you know, your children, your grandchildren, your friends and your neighbors, who do they rely on if they don't already feel like you feel? There is no hope. If we give up in this contest, there is no hope for those that we claim to love in the process.